April 1953, Studio B at KHJ Radio Studios in Los Angeles. Frank Sinatra stands in front of a microphone he doesn't own, recording for a label that doesn't fully believe in him yet. The contract he signed with Capitol Records 2 weeks ago is the kind you sign when you have no leverage, no advance, no guarantee of promotion, just a handshake and a chance. He's 37 years old. 5 years ago, he couldn't walk down a street without causing a riot. Now he can barely get a table at the restaurants that used to comp his meals. His voice, the instrument that made him the biggest star in America, cracked on national television 6 months earlier. Hemorrhaged, actually. Mid-performance. The doctors told him to rest. The industry told him he was done. But here he is. 8 songs, 30 minutes of music, a format nobody's tried before, and absolutely everything to lose. To understand what Sinatra was attempting, you have to understand what he'd become by 1953. A punchline. Columbia Records, the label that made him a star, dropped him in 1952. His movie studio MGM let his contract expire. His television show was cancelled. His marriage to Ava Gardner was disintegrating in the gossip columns. His agency stopped returning calls. Bing Crosby, his mentor, was still selling millions. Perry Como owned primetime television. Johnny Ray was the new heartthrob. The music industry had moved on. But there was something else happening beneath the chaos. Sinatra had been listening. While his career collapsed, he'd been studying a new generation of jazz arrangers, people like Billy May, Gordon Jenkins, Nelson Riddle. He'd been hearing the concept albums coming out of smaller labels, collections of songs that told a story, that created a mood. The music industry still operated on singles. You recorded a potential hit, backed it with a throwaway track, and prayed for radio play. Albums were afterthoughts, collections of whatever you had lying around. Sinatra wanted to do something different. He wanted to make albums that felt like experiences, where every song belonged, where the sequencing mattered, where you listened start to finish, not just for the hits. Capitol Records wasn't particularly interested in his vision. They were interested in not losing money. But they gave him a session, 8 songs. If it worked, maybe another. If it didn't, well, Sinatra was cheap now. The first problem, Sinatra's voice wasn't what it used to be. The vocal hemorrhage he'd suffered in 1952 had been serious. He'd pushed too hard on a performance, and something ruptured. The doctors warned him that his voice might never fully recover. At minimum, he needed to relearn how to sing, which meant he couldn't rely on power anymore. Couldn't belt the way he used to. Couldn't sustain those long, showy notes that made teenage girls scream. He had to become a different kind of singer. The second problem, Nelson Riddle, the arranger Capitol assigned him, was practically unknown. Riddle had done some work for Nat King Cole, some radio arrangements, but nothing that suggested he could anchor a Sinatra comeback. He was 31 years old, competent, professional, not a visionary. At least that's what everyone thought. The third problem, the material. Sinatra wanted to record love songs, slow, intimate, aching ballads, the kind of songs that felt like 2 a.m. in an empty bar, songs for people who'd been hurt. Capitol wanted upbeat numbers, novelty songs, something to compete with How Much Is That Doggy in the Window? The compromise was 8 songs, 7 ballads, 1 medium-tempo number to keep the label happy. It felt like the setup to a polite failure. What happened in those April sessions is difficult to reconstruct completely because it happened quietly. No drama, no shouting matches, just Sinatra and Riddle working out an approach in real time. Sinatra had a theory. He believed the microphone had changed singing forever, but most vocalists hadn't caught up. They still sang like they were projecting to the back row of a theater. Big, broad, theatrical. But the microphone let you whisper, let you breathe, let you sound like you were speaking directly into someone's ear at close range. Sinatra wanted to sing like he was alone in a room with one person. Someone he was trying to convince, seduce, console, destroy. Riddle understood. His arrangements became something different, not background music, but conversation. The strings didn't swell. They sighed. The horns didn't punch. They murmured. Everything was close, controlled, almost dangerously intimate. On My Funny Valentine, Sinatra barely raises his voice above a murmur. The lyric, "Your looks are laughable, unphotographical," sounds like a confession, not a declaration. He's not performing romance, he's living inside it. On The Girl Next Door, his phrasing does something unusual. He delays certain words, lets others hang in the air, breathes in places that don't make musical sense but make emotional sense. It sounds like thinking out loud. Capitol's executives listened to the playbacks and didn't know what to make of it. Too slow? Too quiet? Where was the energy? But Sinatra refused to change it. This was the album, Take It or Bury It. The album was released in January 1954 as a 10-inch LP, a format already becoming obsolete. 8 songs. Just over 24 minutes of music. No singles were released beforehand. No major promotional push. Capitol printed a small run and sent it to distributors without much fanfare. Sinatra's name was on the cover, but his name didn't carry the weight it used to. If this failed, it wasn't just an album that flopped, it was proof that Sinatra couldn't adapt. That his moment had passed, that he was a relic of the 1940s with no place in the 1950s. He'd signed a contract with no safety net. He had no film career to fall back on, no television show, no sold-out concert tours. He had 8 love songs on a 10-inch LP that most people would never hear. And then something unexpected happened. At first, nothing. Songs for Young Lovers didn't explode. It didn't top the charts. Billboard barely mentioned it. Radio stations didn't rush to play it. But something else happened. People who bought the album listened to it differently. They didn't put it on at parties. They didn't play it as background music. They sat down. They listened all the way through. They flipped the record over and played the second side. And then they told their friends. Music critics started noticing. Not because the album was revolutionary in an obvious way, but because it felt complete, cohesive, like it had been designed as an experience, not a product. Metronome magazine called it a triumph of taste. Downbeat praised Sinatra's new maturity. The Saturday Review noted something unusual. Sinatra had stopped trying to sing like a star and started singing like a human being, which is exactly what he'd been trying to do. Sales started slowly, then built. Not like a hit single, like a secret being shared. The album found its audience among people who'd been through something, who understood what it meant to sing about loneliness without melodrama. By spring, Capitol started paying attention. Sinatra's commercial stock was rising, but more importantly, his artistic credibility was being rebuilt. He wasn't a nostalgia act anymore. He wasn't a cautionary tale. He was an artist who'd figured out how to evolve. The immediate consequence was professional. Capitol Records, which had signed Sinatra as a low-risk gamble, suddenly realized they had something. In March 1954, just 2 months after Songs for Young Lovers was released, Sinatra was back in the studio recording a follow-up with Nelson Riddle. Swing Easy. That album took the opposite approach. Up-tempo, swinging, joyful. It proved Sinatra wasn't just a torch singer. He had range. He had control. He could own a studio. Then came In the Wee Small Hours in 1955, a darker, deeper concept album entirely about loneliness and heartbreak. 15 songs, all in the same emotional key. The first true concept album in popular music, some would later argue. But the consequence wasn't just more albums. It was a shift in how popular music could be made. Sinatra had proven you could sell albums as complete works. You didn't need a hit single to justify an LP. You could trust an audience to sit with something longer, slower, more emotionally complex. Other artists noticed, jazz musicians especially. Ella Fitzgerald started recording her songbook series, entire albums dedicated to single composers. Miles Davis began thinking about albums as journeys, not collections. The album as an art form. something we take for granted now, partially began here. In a quiet, desperate gamble by a singer everyone thought was finished. For years, songs for young lovers existed in the shadow of what came after. In the Wee Small Hours became the landmark. Songs for Swingin' Lovers became the party album. Only the Lonely became the masterpiece of melancholy. But musicians kept coming back to songs for young lovers. Something about it felt different, raw, less polished in a way that made it more emotionally direct. Tony Bennett later called it the album where Sinatra found himself again. Quincy Jones pointed to Sinatra's phrasing on My Funny Valentine as a turning point where technique became transparency. In 2000, the album was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame. Not for its commercial success, it never went platinum, never topped the charts, but for its influence, for being the album where a comeback stopped being about ego and became about artistry. Critics began to notice what Riddle had done with the arrangements, how he'd used space, how the orchestra breathed with Sinatra instead of pushing against him, and listeners kept discovering it, not as a historical artifact, but as a living document of what it means to rebuild yourself when everything falls apart. The influence of songs for young lovers is difficult to measure because it's foundational. It established the template Sinatra would use for the next decade. Collaborative albums with great arrangers, organized around moods and themes. That approach became the blueprint for the Capitol years, which many consider Sinatra's artistic peak. It proved the concept album could work commercially in popular music. When the Beatles made Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967, they were working in a format Sinatra helped legitimize. It changed the way vocalists approached microphones. Sinatra's intimate conversational style became the standard for pop and jazz singers. You can hear it in Chet Baker, in Astrud Gilberto, in countless crooners who learned that restraint could be more powerful than volume. But maybe the deepest influence is harder to quantify. Songs for Young Lovers is an album about survival, about what you do when your career collapses, your voice breaks, and your best option is reinvention. Sinatra didn't try to reclaim what he'd lost. He became something else. That's the lesson other artists absorbed. When Bob Dylan went electric, when Johnny Cash recorded at Folsom Prison, when David Bowie killed Ziggy Stardust, they were all doing what Sinatra did in 1953. They were refusing to be what they used to be. Songs for Young Lovers is 8 songs, 24 minutes. An album most people couldn't name if you asked them about Frank Sinatra's best work. But it's the album where everything changed, not because it was radical, not because it shattered conventions, but because it was honest. Sinatra walked into that studio with nothing. No leverage, no guarantees, no safety net. Just a damaged voice and a belief that he could still make something worth hearing. He didn't make an album to prove he was still a star. He made an album to prove he was still an artist. That distinction matters. The music industry has always rewarded reinvention, but only when it's successful. Sinatra's reinvention was successful because it was necessary. Because he had no choice but to strip away everything that didn't matter and focus on what did. The songs, the phrasing, the emotional truth. 70 years later, Songs for Young Lovers still sounds like a conversation happening in real time. Like someone figuring out who they are while you listen. That's not nostalgia. That's not historical importance. That's an album that refuses to age. Because the question it answers, what do you do when everything falls apart? Never gets old. You start over. You sing quieter. You tell the truth.